My name is Terry Moore. I'm one of the career counselors. I work in counseling and psychological services down at the Tang Center. My work happens to be entirely with UC Berkeley staff in relation to issues of career development, career planning, exploration, self-assessment, and all manner of things having to do with, sometimes people come to us because they're finding that they're a little bit stuck with regard to perhaps a bit of resistance that they are dealing with internally or other issues. So I'm just thrilled to be here with you today, and the topic is going to be career resilience. So we'll get started momentarily. One small housekeeping detail is that the slides you don't have in front of you. Instead, what you have is a short workbook based on the same presentation materials. If you would like the slides, I would be happy to send them to you by email. So I'm going to pass around this clipboard, so please feel free to let us know, and our career library assistant, Chris Garcia, will be very happy to send those to you. So, career-related resilience. On the front page of the workbook in front of you is the same information, the agenda for the next hour that we're going to spend together. What I hope to accomplish is to work with you to help identify aspects of resilience that are related specifically to work. There's been a great deal written about resilience and a lot of research over the last several years. It's a very important topic these days, and we're going to relate it specifically to the workplace. That includes actually a chance to take a snapshot yourself of where you think you stand with relation to several aspects of career resilience. So knowing that it is simply a snapshot for you to get started from where you are today to where you'd like to be in terms of resilience. That's one thing we're going to have a chance to do today. And then to identify some specific actions you can take related to each of those components. As always, I want to make sure that if there are resources on campus that I can help to inform you about them. So I'll try to do that as we go through today's agenda. Okay, we have a little over an hour together, so let's get started. So this is a list of fundamental career management habits that any career development book is likely to promote. The idea is that sometimes these go under the heading of career-related resilience. So to have a resilient career, that means being prepared, right? So that would mean being able to describe the value you bring to your work, as well as all of the other items, the other 3 items on this list. So let me just ask you, how many of you feel like you can easily accomplish or work with every one of these 4 points, that you're ready to take them on today? Now, you could do all 4 of these things. So how many people feel like they are ready to take on all 4 of these career management habits, that you do these regularly? Okay, so that's actually very typical. You know, these things they may sound really simple and they may look very simple on paper, but there's a lot that goes into them. So sometimes what we find is that as straightforward as these may look on the page, they may not be so straightforward to accomplish. A lot of the time that has to do with what goes on inside of us, and that's where I'm going to kind of linger today. Career resilience, as I'm going to try and speak about it today, is largely about what goes on inside of you that helps to either promote these habits or hinder them. And what are some of the things that you can do to increase the resilience that you have, and therefore be better able to sit down and write that resume, you know, even though you've been intending to do it for the last, I don't know, a couple weeks or even up to several months. Does that make sense? Great. So what is resilience? In the physical world, you know, the physical scientists actually use the word resilience. I was actually kind of surprised to see that, but material scientists talk about a resilient material being one that will rebound to its original shape once it's bent. So what does that mean in terms of people? Actually, I'm used to hearing the word resilience in relation to what makes a resilient person. I think the image that's on this page on the lower right is really very telling. This is a group of children in Bangladesh in the aftermath of a cyclone in 2007. And they are beginning their journey to rebuild their community. It's, I think, quite an image of resilience. One of the things I especially like about it is that they're holding hands as they begin to recover from this traumatic or adverse circumstance. So, in fact, what we're going to be talking about is that ability to bounce back after change or adversity. Have you seen this before? How many people have seen this before? Okay, a couple. William Bridges is a consultant and a coach and an author who's done a lot of work around change, and specifically around the personal internal process of change. And he distinguishes it by calling it transition. There are other researchers who've done work on this as well. But this curve is the thing I want you to really notice. So any change, when we're dealing with it as an individual, begins actually with an ending. We're leaving an old state in transition to a new state. Many things have to happen along the way. That journey almost always means some kind of a bit of a dip at first, before the individual affected kind of climbs out and reaches the new state that they're striving for, whether it's a change that they sought out, or whether it's a change that has come to them without their seeking it. And in fact, we go through this process whether we sought out the change or not, so even if it's a very positive change. What the dip is showing us is that several things about performance, energy level, sometimes mood, will take a dip in the midst of change. So that can be change. It can also be adversity. In some ways, I guess I should acknowledge that I'm kind of using those words interchangeably for what we're talking about today. It could be any kind of a problem, any disappointment. We're talking about basically some kind of change of state. So what's interesting about this in relation to resilience is the trajectory of this curve as it goes down and then goes up again. The depth of it, the length of it, that is, it varies tremendously from person to person, from change to change. But the basic dynamic is still there. One thing that makes a big difference to whether people actually begin to climb up out of the dip fairly quickly after encountering adversity, or another thing that we sometimes see is that someone will start to rebound after a change or adversity, and then they'll dip back down again. And then they'll come up, and they may kind of, languish a little bit in this what I'm calling a dip for a little while before they start reaching forward through exploration and commitment to the new state. Resilience is a big variable that affects how long that's going to take, how much that person has the experience of kind of feeling better and then feeling worse again, and so on. So 8 components of resilience have been described. We see resilience discussed in a lot of different terms, but I actually like this set of 8 components, and this is what I'm using actually to organize our time together today. This is from a book called Building Resiliency: How to Thrive in Times of Change. And these 8 components are definitely related to career, and they definitely affect us in more than one way. Almost all of them do that. In the spirit of letting you know about resources that are available on campus, this book, by the way, is available through the UC Learning Center as an ebook through the eLearn process. So feel free to check it out. And there are actually quite a number of books on resilience in that same collection. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. So knowing that we're going to be talking about these 8 components for the next hour, take a look in your workbook in front of you at pages 2 and 3, where you'll find a little worksheet. So go ahead and take about 5 minutes to place yourself where you think you are today in relation to these 8 components on a continuum that's in front of you. There's a front and a back side. And after you have a chance to fill this out for yourself, I'm actually going to ask you to discuss it with one other person in the room. So I'll be back with you in about 5 minutes to get you going on that. Okay, So, you probably noticed that one of the components of resilience we're working with today is about professional and personal networks. And there's been a lot of discussion today. Several of the presenters that I've had a chance to enjoy talked about the importance of networking, and I'm going to do the same thing. But I want to encourage you to take the next 5 minutes or so to talk with each other about the questions at the bottom of this worksheet. And this is a chance to meet someone new if you see folks in the room who you haven't worked with or met before. So take the first minute or so just to introduce yourselves to each other and discover where you work. And then have some conversation about these two questions. What were some of the highlights of your conversations with each other? Yes, Kathy.
So my partner is in a, oh no, I project so loud. Oh, they do? Okay, so my partner is ready for a change and is actually really wanting a change and feels stagnated by the fact that there's not things available for her to move into, which I think is a really frustrating spot to be, because it's like you want to be resilient and bounce into something new, but there's nothing new to bounce into, so you're just sort of stuck waiting. I don't know what strengths you would use to develop in resiliency to make that part easier.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah. So one thing that strikes me about that is the importance of perseverance in career development. And persevering amid, those kinds of situations where there might not be yet the thing you want to bounce into and so on, actually includes the resilience while you're staying in place. And the perseverance to keep looking, keep trying, right? So one of the things that we know about perseverance is that it's some of the best predictors about career resilience, about perseverance, are the 4 aspects that we call self-efficacy. And those are paying attention to your past accomplishments, learning from role models, actually getting encouragement from other people, and then paying attention to your own emotional, mental, and physiological reactions. So in a way, I'd call that anxiety reduction, right? And so those 4 things in combination can really help people to cultivate a positive and realistic conception of their own abilities to move forward with things. So one of the things that I think while someone is sort of waiting for the perfect thing to appear is, how do you keep going? How do you keep motivated every day, right? And so cultivating those self-efficacy attitudes is really helpful around that. And that helps to bolster your confidence, so when there is something to apply for, that you go into it boldly and confidently. What else did people notice? What struck you as you went through these 8 components of career resilience? Did you find that there were some areas where you were more to the left and some where you were more to the right? Yeah. Is that true for most of the folks in the room? Okay, about half. We would expect that everybody would have, a combination of strengths and perhaps development areas. So I want to invite us to talk a little bit about each one of these aspects and to consider some of the things that might be helpful to you as you cultivate those areas you choose to. The workbook, by the way, has questions that are good reflection questions on each one of these 8 areas. So we won't be going into them all today in depth, of course, but I would definitely encourage you to use these as touchstones for yourself. But first of all, acceptance of change. I love this quote, Benjamin Franklin. When you're finished changing, you're finished. So change is pretty inevitable, right? I really appreciated Vice Chancellor Wilton's laying that out for us all today and acknowledging that it is a very dynamic environment that we all are operating in. So that may not be something we have a lot of control over, how much change there is, but how we relate to that amount of change is something that we can affect. So acceptance of change is basically about looking at, what's the reality? I found this statistic that was really kind of striking to me. In 1870, there were 1,500 patents issued in the United States. Guess how many were issued in the year 2000? 5 times that. How about 100 times that? Right? So 150,000 patents were issued in a single year, only 13 years ago. So I mention this because the pace of change is actually increasing all around us, not just at Cal, in the world at large. It's here to stay. And there's been a fair amount of research done about, sort of the internal dynamics of technological change and how it affects organizations' responses. And so part of what we're seeing in the world at large, in the world of work, is responses to technologies that enable things to be done in different ways and more productively. So it makes resilience more important than ever. So some things that can be very helpful around our relationship to change include things like staying tuned in. So by being here today, you really are doing that. You're being tuned in to what the events are around you and the developments around you. That's critically important so that you're not blindsided. It's impossible to pay attention to everything, but to the degree that you can take time periodically to read the Berkeley newsletter that comes out electronically, to notice what's going on with the people around you, it really is beneficial. Tune into your physical and mental well-being. How many people exercise regularly, just as an example of self-care? Oh, good, that's great. I mention that because it's one of the things that often people say that they don't have time for in terms of self-care, but it's awfully important. Long-term stress certainly challenges us physically as well as emotionally and mentally. So one of the ways that we can not only cope with it, but actually reduce the stress level that we're feeling to the stressors externally is to practice self-care. Looking at the change itself, what do you think I mean by that? Not every change is equal, right? Have you ever been in a situation where change came up and it looked entirely negative, but there was something in it that turned out to be a positive for you? Yeah. Would you be willing to share a little bit about that?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
My previous job, I was a litigator in San Francisco, and one of the issues that I faced in that work environment was that it was very hierarchical and it's very top down, and if you're wrong, you're wrong, and if you're right, you're still wrong. And that just took a little bit of adjustment to learn, being that I was always somebody who was in school, and mistakes are part of learning. But in some environments, because the cost may be quite high, or people just don't want to look bad, or other things, you have to learn to adapt to that kind of culture and environment. And that was really frustrating at the time, because it seemed like I didn't know what I was doing. I was at a new job, and it was incredibly stressful and demanding. I was working really long hours, 7 a.m. to 4 a.m. at times, and on months on end, depending on the projects. But instead of just wallowing in that, which I did for a while, and that's very, very normal, I think, like you, rather than looking for the change to come to you, or to say, like, why isn't there an opportunity, to take that into my hands and say, well, okay, I can't make a drastic change right now. There's no way I'm going to change an organization that's been here for 100 years and change the culture, but what I can do is change how I respond to it. I'm a person who's known to be very frank, and certain environments, that's not the best for you. And then learning to, one, pick my battles, and then two, think about what kind of environment do I want to be in. And fortunately, in that organization, there were a lot of teams that I worked with. Some were really hierarchical, others were really like, oh, just be more entrepreneurial. And it was sort of hard to figure out what was the right approach, but in learning through those processes, I realized what worked for me. And in transitioning to my next job, I figured out where could I go to be successful, and recognizing that not every environment is successful for you, because it's not a good fit for you. So that's a very important part of job searching, is to say, you're all really talented and gifted in so many ways, but you have to find a place that values what you can bring to the table, and that your values fits with that particular culture, so that you can be as successful as possible. So it allowed me to kind of see it in a different light, instead of playing the blame game.
Yeah.
I was just like, you know what, it just wasn't a good fit. Like if this is the way it's gonna work, and I'm somebody who's a self-starter and entrepreneurial, going into that environment isn't a good place. And so I'm in a place now where, you know, I can approach people with a lot of new ideas. There was always pushback, but you know, if you present a good idea and be more purposeful in what you're doing and allow them to see what value this will bring to the organization, they're more open to that. So I think in that sense, it was a struggle, but I was able to learn a lot from that struggle and say what can work for me in the future, and it really allowed me to find a place that I'm incredibly happy with.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate that. So there's two sides of things, and the learning that we get out of adversity or things that are disappointing to us or not a good fit can often be terribly valuable to us and often represent a gain. So what's interesting too is to think about in any given change, what are the aspects that you have some kind of control in, and what are the ones that you don't? And in that picture, where is your energy best spent? So I would invite you to look through on your own the workbook for some reflection questions about your relationship with change and to try a few scenarios. Continuous learning. This is actually one of my favorites. Eric Hoffer is an interesting guy. He actually endowed a poetry prize at UC Berkeley. So he was sort of a social philosopher, and this quote I love: "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." So that attitude of continuous learning. There's been actually a lot around campus about the importance of continuous learning. It's embedded in the operating principles, the competencies, and so on. I love the 70-20-10 rule, and I have to acknowledge Marianne Rasmussen for the metaphor of the cogs in a machine that fit together to talk about the 70-20-10 rule. The concept comes from adult learning theory and research over the past few years that we grown-ups actually do about 70% of our learning through what we actually do, through the actual experience that we have and the work that we do. About 20% comes from our relationships. It's one of the reasons that mentoring, coaching are so important and vital. Anytime you're watching a role model, critically important. And then about 10% of what we learn actually comes from formal learning environments. And actually, alas, that includes workshops like this. But I would never be someone who would say, all right, so you never have to read another book because that's only 10% anyway. That's not it at all. Which is why I love this metaphor of the cogs in a machine and how they turn each other. So that 10% of the learning that you get through reading actually turns the cog, you know, that lets you also learn from role modeling, and then that turns the cog that lets you gain that 70% of your learning, consolidating it from what you actually do, from putting that learning to work. Kathy?
I was just going to add to that the way I try to think of the 10% is whenever I'm in a formal setting, like a classroom or a workshop where I'm reading a book, I try to think, how can I go turn around and apply that to the experience that I have at work or in life? Because then that way, when it's applied, that's how that cog turns, right?
And it becomes part of you. It becomes part of your skill set by actually using it. So one of the things that I want to invite you to do today, and I hope you've been doing it all day long, is when you've heard a presentation and something struck you as something you want to apply, to make some sort of commitment to yourself to how you can do something with that in the next couple of weeks. And what we tend to do tends to be what we write down, what we commit to ourselves. So in fact, at the end of your workbook today, I'm going to ask you to jot down anywhere from 1 to 3 things that you can do in the interest of building your own career resiliency in the next couple of weeks. Okay. So when you hear about continuous learning, when you hear that phrase, any thoughts or feelings come to mind for you? Are you excited about it? I see some nods. People like continued learning often. Any negative emotions or any negative or self-doubting thoughts arise for you? Yeah? Well, it wouldn't be surprising. Carolyn, would you mind sharing what you're hearing? Thanks, Simone.
A lot of my more self-doubting thoughts about continuous learning actually come from the, am I going to be able to use this? Will this be useful to me? That kind of thing, more than like seeing it's like, okay, well, I've learned this, but I don't see how I'm going to use it.
Okay.
That kind of thing. Not doubting that I can learn it so much as doubting that I can apply it effectively.
Yeah. And is it the best use of your time? Is it about how much of the investment? Yeah, so those are choices that you were called on to make all the time, isn't it? Yeah. So have you had experiences where you didn't necessarily think that, in retrospect, it was the highest and best use of your time?
Yeah, I've had instances like that where I've gone to workshops or sat through things and like, I'm not sure that this is where I need to be. I, for instance, we've been going through the OE thing here at the university, and I was tapped to go and sit in on some planning meetings and stuff. And they were like, you're going to learn so much from this. This is going to be great. And I came out of that going, I'm not sure that actually applies to what I do.
Okay. All right. I want to invite you to reframe that slightly, just slightly, which is, I'm not sure it applies to what I'm doing right now. You know, it's very interesting how over time these things sort of come back, and all of a sudden you're thinking, oh yeah, I remember. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into my files because of something that I got 6 months ago that all of a sudden becomes pertinent. So just a thought there. But you know, one reason that sometimes people get self-doubting thoughts or kind of like the idea of continuous learning but may not necessarily take the steps to learn something new. Technology is a great example of this. I'm not a very tech-savvy person. I can use the software, but if I have to troubleshoot it, oh my gosh, that's an entirely different thing. I might shy away from it. This is why it's our old friend, the transition curve. So when you're learning something new, in fact, you're thrown right into the transition curve again. So I'm using it rather liberally, but when you learn something new, actually performance declines a little bit at first and then comes back up. And when I'm sitting at my computer and something has just encountered a glitch or I get an error message, believe me, I am looking at the fact that my performance is going to dip a little bit, or my productivity, as I stop what I'm doing and try and do this problem solving. But always, you know, if I can, take the time to do that or find a time to do it in the future. I find that, in fact, I have gained something through it. But this is not just technology, but it's any kind of new learning. So what I'd like to ask you to do is turn in your workbook to the page about continuous learning. And I want to ask you to spend about 5 minutes answering the questions for yourself. You don't have to jot down full sentences. Just jot down keywords about questions number 1 and number 2. So as you think about the items that you wrote down for yourself, anything pop out at you? Anything striking or new? Or did it confirm something you already knew? Sometimes what happens is that people see a pattern that they didn't notice before. So the next question I just would want to plant as a seed for you is, how are you going to act on those learnings, and what is it that you're going to do going forward? For instance, we just talked about, I was just mentioning, you know, writing down 3 things you learned in the last week. But you'll see that that's followed by a suggestion to make time to do that periodically. Is that something that you could do 3 times a week, that you could pause and notice what you've learned that day? And how can you make that a reality for yourself? How can you make space for that in the days that we know are very busy right now? Well, one way is that we tend to do what we schedule. So put it on your planner. Sometimes people like the idea of bookending their day by doing 5 minutes of planning in the morning and 5 minutes of recap at night. Include this for yourself. Let's talk a little bit about the next one. Self-empowerment. I like this metaphor, the CEO role in your own career. William Bridges has written a book called Creating You and Company. It's in the Career Counseling Library at the Tang Center. I invite you to check it out. It's actually quite useful. But when you think about what a CEO does, what the chief executive officer does in any organization, what comes to mind? I'll repeat the words that pop out so we don't have to move the microphone around. Pam?
Decision making.
Decision making. Good. What else? Yes.
Planning.
Planning. Good. Control. Okay. Accountability. Great. Policy. Could we add policy? How about strategy? So strategy can kind of resonate for people quite a bit because it's that very highest level sort of decision making. What direction? This is about setting direction. In part, it's about leadership as well. And leadership is many things, but in part, leadership is keeping you motivated, keeping the staff motivated. So in your career, you get to make all those decisions. They are conscious decisions, absolutely. When a CEO is taking that accountability and being responsible for the direction going ahead, do they know everything? Can they possibly know everything? So there's risk involved, isn't there? So the CEO isn't always necessarily going to be right. Not always, but there's a certain degree of risk that she or he is equipped to take based on what they know now. So there's also presiding over sort of the day-to-day operations. I mean, we all go to work, we all get the job done and so on. But if you step back, what the CEO role is about is taking an overview of your career, where you are now, and what's the strategy you want to enact, what direction do you want to head, and how are you going to keep yourself motivated? I see this resiliency part as how do you as the CEO reward your own efforts? How do you keep yourself motivated? And that's part of that. We talked about perseverance a little bit. So there is a broader context here. The CEO reports usually to a board of directors of some kind, and there's always risk. So there's always accountability to something, knowing that you can't know all the answers. What do you see about your own career that mirrors this in any way, or that you can take from this about the CEO role in your own career? Yeah.
As a manager, I think I definitely preside over my own day-to-day things.
Okay, great. She said as a manager, she presides over her day-to-day things. What about the longer term? Yeah, Pam?
Well, a good example, I think, is this temporary job I took over the past 8 months. I really didn't know if it would do everything for me that I wanted it to. I hoped it would position me in a place where I could get in touch with other opportunities and maybe find a permanent job out of it. And there was quite a bit of risk now that I look back. And in fact, maybe about 75% of what I wanted to get out of it didn't happen.
Okay.
But the 25% that did happen was getting me out of my slump and getting me out into the University of Berkeley world again. And so there was some gain, even though it wasn't what I wanted it to be.
Yeah, yeah.
But there was a lot of risk.
There was a lot of risk. Yeah, and I think we face that all the time, don't we? That there's risk. Yeah. Sense of purpose, though. This is one of those things that keeps, when I think of the mission statement of an organization, it's a lot like, what is your own personal sense of purpose? And why is that important? So Kofi Annan is quoted as saying, to live is to choose, but to choose you must know who you are and what you stand for, where you want to go, and why you want to get there. So in relation to your career resilience, some of why this is important is that if you have an overarching sense of purpose, it can really help keep setbacks in perspective. So it helps, of course, guide choices in action, decide which risks you want to take, which ones you would prefer not to. It provides a framework for you and helps sustain perseverance when the going gets tough. So that overarching sense of purpose often is related to the most fulfilling activities that we find ourselves really engaging with. You know, do you have some activities in your work life or your life outside of work where all of a sudden you feel really engaged and energized? Yeah, what's an example of that? What really engages you? Yes?
I find it really engaging when I get to interact with the students on campus.
Interacting with students on campus, and it really engages you in and of itself. There's something special about that for you. Pay attention to those things. Pay attention to those things where you get a lot of energy from, because it's probably saying something about a key value that you have, or something about your sense of purpose. One of the workshops that we conduct actually has to do with your work-related values. And so if this is something that you find on your resiliency worksheet, that this is an area that you consider a growth need for yourself, consider that workshop or the materials about values that we have on the website. Personal identity. Now what we're talking about is, in addition to your work life, there are many other facets of your life, and if you look across all of those areas of life, you're really seeing your personal identity, which is kind of your own unique stamp about it. What's important here is that who you are as a whole person stands with you throughout adversity, and it's actually, we talk about work-life balance. Some people talk about work-life integration. The key here is to be aware of what your whole personhood is about, how you see your identity, and to make sure that you're using that to create alignment between your feelings, your beliefs, your values, and your actions. It's an important aspect of resilience. Personal and professional networks. So you've heard a lot about that today. How do you think it might help with your resiliency? And our video person has asked that we take the microphone around if people are offering things. Sorry about that. Yeah, exactly. So how do the networks that you have professionally and personally contribute to your sense of resilience, your ability to bounce back? So I was talking about any kind of self-efficacy, which is really your belief in your ability to do something. And that always has at least 4 components, and one of them is the encouragement that you get. So building your network, nurturing your network, and so on actually helps you to not only to stay tuned to what's happening around you, achieve goals, but also for coping. So your networks are terribly important all the way around, including for your resilience. Transferable skills is one of my very favorite tactics and strategies for creating resilience and nurturing it. Transferable skills, if you look at this diagram, what you're seeing is that there are certain things that we enjoy. For instance, you were talking about enjoying really relating to students. And the more you do that, the more satisfaction you feel, most likely, and the more skilled you get at it. So this is where we come to the juncture between the things that innately interest you and the things that you develop skills around. It's through practicing that you get more skilled at it. And that, of course, promotes a sense of accomplishment, which in turn promotes further action. You're more likely to do that thing again, whatever it is. So I want to invite you to think about transferable skills in a couple of ways here. One of them, of course, is be aware of what your skills are and how that you use professionally and what other roles you might use them in. But also, I want to invite you to think about it another way as well. Are there ways in which you can continue to build skills that are important to you that might not necessarily be directly related to the work you do now, taking you into venues where you might have the experience of building a skill that you can then bring back into your professional life. A good example was actually offered by Vice Chancellor Wilton this morning. Remember, he was talking about his son and his college education. And he was saying that one of the key things he felt that his son learned was through the debate club, which wasn't a formal class. It was something that wasn't part of his GPA, but a huge way to learn transferable skills. Anybody have any examples of things that you've done outside of work, perhaps, that have cultivated a skill that you've used professionally?
I joined Toastmasters, and
Yeah.
I use that in my professional career as a stand-up facilitator and trainer.
Great, great. Were you intentional about that when you joined it?
Yes, I was.
Okay, so it was actually a purposeful strategy for you.
Yes, because I wanted to switch careers into
Yeah.
training and professional development, and I realized I didn't have the stand-up skills I needed. So it was a very safe way of learning those skills, and then being able to prove when I had a job application or an interview that I actually could do that.
That's a great career development strategy. Thanks for that. How about others? Have you done anything like that? Some of the, I used some images here. You can see on the lower left someone coaching a softball team, a children's softball team. It's another safe way, to go out. And volunteering is I think volunteering is one of the best career development, self-development strategies there is. Not only does it give you new skills, give you a chance to hone existing skills, but also build your network at the same time. I see a couple of nods around the room, so it seems like a couple of folks might have experienced that as well. So in the workbook that you have, take a look at the questions about transferable skills. So on page 8 and 9, I'd like you to take 5 minutes and take a look at questions 1 and 2. And jot down some keywords for yourself. Okay, so it seemed like people were having some lively conversations. What did you find was straightforward about this, and what took a little more perseverance to think about these two questions? What was it like to think about different roles that you could use your existing skills in?
Well, I don't know if what I found challenging about this, and what we realized at the very end when we ran out of time talking about it, was that we're prioritizing everybody else's work or everybody else's things and not our own development or the things that we need to do for ourselves. And so that just keeps getting put off, put off, put off. And so then when you want to develop a new skill, if you never build in time to do it, well, then you're not going to develop the new skill, right?
Yeah, thanks. Did other people have that same observation, that time is short to do self-development? Okay.
I think it's always something that I'm aware of in the background, because it's I'd like to learn how to do that. Oh, I'd like to spend more time on that. And sometimes it's, work-related skills, and sometimes it's, more personal-related skills. But there's always I'd like to, but. And so it wasn't until she said that, I'm like, yeah.
So some real resonance there around that. Yeah. So one of the things that I want to point out is, remember the 70-20-10 rule? If so much of our learning has to do with what we actually do and perform, that alertness to what's happening around us can sometimes prompt us to say, and I'm not certain that this would apply to either of your situations, but it often does apply. Oh yes, I'd like to do that. So just keeping that kind of on your radar screen for when that, whatever that is going to play a role in a work assignment that you might just express some interest in. So that's one possibility. Another thing I guess I wonder is, What about keeping a list of those things, like, oh yes, I'd like to do that and that and that and that? Do people do that? Do you have like a sort of it's almost like a learning plan for yourself?
I've got so many lists.
So many lists, too many lists. Okay, so we have about 5 more minutes together. And I want to just mention the last item here. You've actually been engaging in it all day today. Reflection is an important aspect of building your resilience, and it's important for a couple of reasons. One of them is it's really key to noticing your accomplishments. Perseverance is fed by noticing your accomplishments, giving yourself credit for them, acknowledging, even if it didn't come out perfectly, acknowledging that you did something, you branched out, did something new, and so on. So I want to encourage you to find time, several times a week, just to spend 5-10 minutes to notice, to reflect on your career development, the dilemmas you're having, and so on. Here's something really key. The bottom line on this slide says keep your internal advocate close by. What I'm talking about is that voice inside of you that if you have a self-doubting thought that comes up and says, well, yeah, I did that, but it wasn't perfect. I want you to give that internal advocate that's sitting on your right shoulder equal voice and listen to that voice as it says, well, yeah, but you did it. Yeah, but you did something new. That's so important for cultivating self-efficacy beliefs and also for simply, building your resilience and your perseverance over time. So with that, I'm going to conclude by asking you to take a look at page 10 for just 2 more minutes. And what you've got here is a chance to set down for yourself a couple of things that you commit to yourself to do in the next couple of weeks. So write down 3 steps, 3 small steps that you're at least 70% confident that you can take on in the next 2 weeks. That might just be to make contact again with someone you met today. And last but not least, take note of what it is that you need. What kind of support do you need in order to follow through, and how can you structure that for yourself? I want to point out again, in the spirit of sharing resources, you have a 1-page handout in front of you that's entitled Career Development Model. This is a model that we use to organize some of our career development resources in the partnership that CPS and HR has. What you'll notice is that there are, even though this isn't the same model in terms of career resilience, that you'll see some overlap, like self-understanding, career awareness. The key point is that on the back there's a listing of many of the resources on campus that I want to invite you to be aware of. So if you find that you have a particular interest in getting additional clarity around some of the aspects of your self-assessment, do feel free to avail yourself of any of these resources. And it is a partial list, so there's more. And the most effective managers of their own career use multiple avenues. So feel absolutely free to seek out other resources as well. And last but not least, there is an evaluation sheet in front of you for this workshop. So if you could fill that out, and I think someone is going to collect them at the back of the room on the way out, that would be terrific. And thanks for being with us today. Thanks for joining me for this hour, and I hope you have a great weekend. Best of luck to you.